I built these stands that my jointer and planer sit on a while ago, and they've served me well, but I've always wanted one workstation that they can both sit on together. So, today, we're going to build that workstation. The new workstation will essentially be two cabinets that are connected to one another and sitting on casters. I began by cutting all of the pieces that I needed to begin assembling the cabinets. I'm going to be using pocket hole joinery to make the cabinets, so I began by marking out the location of the pocket holes that I need to drill. In my mind, pocket holes really don't need to be precisely laid out, so I like to just sort of get an idea of what makes a lot of sense to lay them out. So in other words, I rarely ever measure them out to fractions of inches or anything like that. I figure out what makes sense using nice round numbers and lay them out in the way that makes most sense given the size or shape of the panel. I took one more measurement to make it look like I know what I'm doing, and then proceeded to do whatever this is. Once I was done with all the hand tapping, I decided it was time to get back to real work, and with all my pocket hole locations laid out, I began the process of drilling pocket holes. A whole lot of pocket holes. Now with all the pocket holes drilled, or at least what I thought were all the pocket holes drilled, I began the process of assembling the cabinet. I started by lightly clamping down the first wall, and I did this because I needed it to stay in place, but I also wanted to check for square against the front and back of the cabinet itself. I spent a little bit of time fussing around with this first wall, trying to get it exactly right with the bottom of the cabinet. Once I was happy with the square measurements, I clamped down tightly so I could begin driving the pocket hole screws. With the pocket hole screws in place, I removed the clamps, gave the sidewall a firm wiggle, declared that's not going anywhere, and then moved on to the next step. I realized that I cut one of the cabinet walls larger than it needed to be, so I shaved off the side in order to fit it where it was going. Now that the wall was cut to the correct measurement, I clamped everything into place, checked it for square, and got ready to drive more pocket hole screws. There are a lot of pocket hole screws in this project, and as anyone who's worked with pocket holes in the past likely knows, there's a tendency for the workpiece to wander a little bit as you drive these screws into their holes. Clamps do an okay job keeping the workpiece from moving, but sometimes I find it's best to move the clamps around as you're driving screws into new areas on the workpiece. Now the only remaining wall is the back of the cabinet that the planer will sit on. It slid into place pretty much perfectly, which was a welcome surprise. The only problem that I did notice at this point is that the partition that separates the two cabinets was supposed to be the same height as the two walls for the planer cabinet, and it was slightly taller than those other two walls. With the back wall in place, it was time to start driving more pocket hole screws. Now it was time to address this problem of the partition wall being too tall for the other two walls that make up the planer cabinet. I decided I would use a scrap piece of board and simply line it up with the height of the other two walls and support it on the partition wall. To get it to the right depth, I simply drew this pencil line and then planned to take it over to the table saw to cut it down to the right size. I've yet to make a crosscut sled for this table saw. I know, I must not be a real woodworker then. Instead, I used this piece of scrap wood and the match fit system from Microjig to make an enhancement on the miter gauge that came with the saw. It works really well. It works even better when you put it in the right way. With the board cut to the correct depth and pocket holes drilled into it, it was time to secure it to the partition wall. I clamped it into place, checked it for square, and then proceeded to drive screws into the wall for support. Now, it would have been a really good idea if I had drilled pilot holes. It also would have been a really good idea if I had clamped the back of the board to the partition, which I decided to do afterwards when I noticed it moving as I drove that first screw into it. Speaking of the benefit of those pilot holes, now it was time to lay the top of the planer cabinet on and make sure that I had it cut to the correct size. It fit pretty good. It was a little short depth-wise, so it doesn't quite go to the front like I had planned, but I can live with that. I then clamped it in place to get ready to drive more pocket hole screws. I started with the screws for the inside of the cabinet. Now, some of you may point out I'm doing this in the wrong direction for pocket hole screws, and I know that. But I also have a fair amount of experience. You know what? Never mind. It occurred to me after I had everything put together that I forgot to drill the pocket holes in the top of the back panel of the jointer cabinet. So instead of taking everything apart, I went out and bought a different pocket hole jig that would allow me to drill the holes while everything was assembled. I began by marking out the location of the pocket holes that I needed to drill. While I certainly prefer drilling pocket holes with the Kreg K5 jig, this jig came in quite handy in this situation. Plus there's the fact that I now own 2 pocket hole drill bits and 2 Robertson bits. That could come in quite handy at some point in the future. This jig is a little bit messier though, because there's no way to set up any kind of dust collection to it. That being said, it worked out extremely well, right up until about now. Honestly, I thought I'd broken it. It sat very lopsided once I knocked it off into the floor. It turns out, though, that this thing comes apart in a couple of different pieces, so I had just snapped it out of its locked position and needed to pop it back into place. Once that was done, we were ready to continue. I also forgot to drill pocket holes on this side as well, but first, I needed to remove the trash can from the shot. Then I could start drilling more pocket holes, while you stare into the bathroom of my workshop. With the pocket holes all drilled, it was time to line up the top of the jointer cabinet, which matched up far better than the planer cabinet, actually. Once in place, I clamped it down to get ready to drive yet more pocket hole screws. And just a couple more of incorrectly positioned pocket hole screws remaining. And we're done. For this next part, I'm going to let the audio captured on the camera explain what happened.
These are 22 and 11/16. Well, that's a nice round number to remember. This side, 23 and 13/16. At least it's mostly consistent top to bottom. All right. So I got 19 tall. That's the way it should have been. And just about 24 tall, which was also correct. I should be writing this down. Otherwise, I'm going to have to do it all over again.
With all of that figured out, it was time to start cutting the pieces for the drawers I needed to construct. I started by cutting the bottoms of the drawers out of the particle board, and I hit the tripod that the camera was sitting on. Now with the tripod moved, I could begin cutting the bottoms of the drawers out. With the drawer bottoms all cut out, now I began cutting all of the drawer sides. With all of my pieces for the drawers cut out, I began laying out the position of my pocket holes. And after about an hour or so of layout, I was ready to do more layout. With all of the hole locations finally laid out, I could begin one last marathon of pocket hole drilling. With all the pocket holes drilled, it was now time to put together all of the drawers. I started by clamping them into place, checking for square, and then getting ready to drive all the pocket hole screws. With the drawers assembled, it was now time to put the drawer slides in place. I drilled pilot holes and then secured them in place with screws. Next, it was time to put the cabinet slides in. I actually ended up abandoning the clamps here. It turns out I really didn't need them to hold the slides in place while I was drilling pilot holes before I secured the slides in place with screws. I started to worry that the weight on this workstation would be too much for a single piece of particle board on the bottom. So I came up with this solution. I didn't have a lot of extra plywood lying around, but I had enough to do this. Next up, I began planning out where I was going to fasten the casters to the bottom of the cabinet. I laid them in rough place and traced out areas where the holes in the caster bases are. The casters actually come with bolts, but they wouldn't be long enough to drive through the plywood and the particle board, so instead I'm just going to use regular cabinet screws to fasten them to the bottom of this workstation. Once I had all the holes traced out for all of the casters, I began drilling pilot holes for the screws that I would eventually put in place. Now it was time to fasten the casters to the bottom of the workstation. Even though I'm using panhead cabinet screws, I also used washers to make sure that the head of the screw was wide enough for the holes in the bases of the casters. After I recovered from the hernia I got, lifting the workstation off the workbench and putting it on the floor, I put the planer and the jointer on the workstation and put it in place. I'm quite pleased with how it came out. I'm planning to repurpose the jointer cabinet as a cupboard I'll hang up on the wall somewhere in my workshop. And as for the old planer cabinet, I never really liked this stand that I built some time ago for my oscillating spindle sander, so now the sander is going to go on the planer cabinet. I'm happy that I'm going to be able to use it on this now, and I'll repurpose the 2x4s for the old sander stand some other way. Hey, thanks for watching, everybody, and I'll see you next time.